Strategies for Analysis, a handy guide. This is a review of the steps to analyzing anything you're reading that we followed after There Will Come Soft Rains, and that we've been using step by step with Mouse as well. The first step, of course, is to read for comprehension. This is the purpose of all those reading strategies you heard about in the previous video, as well as in class and all the note-taking strategies and everything else that we've done that helps you truly understand what's happening when you're reading. It doesn't mean you're going to be able to analyze all the figurative language and other things that are not directly stated the first time, but in order to do any of those things, you've got to understand the plot, character, and setting first, and that's what reading for comprehension is for. So, when you are reading something, and especially after too, you can ask yourself questions like these. Did you understand the setting, the characters, and the plot of the story? If you understand those three things, and you'll remember that you've taken notes on those before, it will help you very much to understand everything else as well. Before we move on to step 2, we should define what analyzing something is. It is examining the parts of a story to see how they work. So you would ask yourself questions like, what is not explicitly stated about the setting, characters, and the plot? And that's a good place to start. So step 3 is the setting. What other information can we gather about the setting besides the information that anybody could plainly see looking at the story? What is not directly stated? For example, when we read There Will Come Soft Rains, the story is set in a city in California because it tells us that. However, it's also set in a city that's just been destroyed clearly by a nuclear bomb, even though that's not directly stated. So there's some things that the setting tells us even without the story having to just write it word for word. As far as the characters go, we can ask ourselves things like, who are the characters, the key characters in the story? What more can we say about them beyond simply understanding, what they did or what their name is? So in There Will Come Soft Rains, there are no people, but what can we understand about the things that are described like characters, like the house that's given human qualities? It's called paranoid and protective, for example. In Mouse, Vladek is the main character of the story, but the author Art is also an important character too, and so it's their relationship that drives a lot of the story, even though Art isn't a part of a lot of the story. So, what more can we say about Art and Vladek that isn't directly stated? For example, we might ask ourselves questions like, in the parts of the story when Vladek is an old man, how can we tell he's still got issues from when he survived the Holocaust? Is there anything we could see without it being directly stated that we might not be directly told in the story? And then we can also ask things like, how does this affect Vladek and Art's relationship? Things like that. So the idea is, once we have these questions, which is a reading strategy, by the way, we go back to the story and we find different moments from the beginning, the middle, and the end of the story, or as many as we can at least, that might show some kind of development in their relationship. See if there's some changes from beginning to end in some way. So what details are we going to learn here? And I'll give you some examples right now. In the beginning, it starts off with this, where Artie is going out to visit Vladek, and they hadn't seen each other in 2 years, and he says they weren't close. And so clearly that tells you some things about the relationship in terms of how much of a bond they had going at the point that the author decided to start writing the book. In the middle of the story, there's the little bit where Vladek throws out Art's coat without asking and then gives him a jacket he hates. And that was supposed to tell us a lot about Vladek especially, but their relationship too, because generally people don't throw out other people's jackets without asking. And of course at the end of the story, this is the very end of the story, Art is extremely angry at Vladek for burning his mother's diaries that he wanted to use for his book, and so he calls him a murderer and is very upset. And it's the end of the story, and some people aren't really happy with that end, but you also see development in their relationship. The development might be that it's getting worse, but there is development. And so, like it says there at the bottom, this doesn't have to be a positive development, but the idea is that there is some kind of development, and that's the kind of thing you can check once you understand the sequencing of the story, which is why we read for comprehension first. So, we've done the setting and the characters, which lets us analyze the plot now. The plot begins with 3 parts: the exposition, the beginning, the rising action, and the falling action. And the climax is, just before the falling action too, which is clearly when the conflict reaches its peak. One might argue that the part at the end, where Artie calls Vladek a murderer, even though he had nothing to do with murdering his mother or anything, could be considered the climax of the story because it's when the conflict between the two is at the most intense. If you see that as the main conflict of the story, then that is probably the climax of the story, even though it's right at the end and there is virtually no falling action. So, what parts of the story tell us more than just what happened? Remember, that's the whole point of analysis. We take a look at parts of the story, like the plot or the characters and the setting, and we ask what's not directly stated about them. So, for example, like I just said, we learn more about Art and Vladek's relationship during the story, and the tension builds the entire time, and so the climax of the story is clearly when Art gets angry at Vladek, or at least that's one of the climaxes of the story. There could be others as well. So another thing to look at once you've done those three things is the author and the writing style. But you don't want to do that until you've done setting and character and plot, because it's important to have a feel for the story itself before you look at how the author tells the story, and that's what author and style is. Some terms that you would have heard before, for example, are point of view, imagery, symbolism, plenty of other literary devices, and the idea is that once you have grasped the basics of the story and looked at what's not directly stated there, you can take a look at how the author told the story. For example, why Mouse is told from the author's point of view, and also, of course, Vladek's point of view, since it's his story. So what does each point of view add to the story? What's not directly stated about it? And what do I already know about the character, the setting, and the plot? Because clearly those are going to give us some clues. So we remember a few things about Vladek's story. For example, we see the story from Vladek's point of view during the Holocaust because he was there, and a first-person account is pretty accurate, or at least more emotional and heart-wrenching to read than it would be if it was just a history book, right? And so you can see that this would at least be partially from Vladek's point of view for that purpose. Now, from Artie's purpose, we look at how the author told the story. So every time it's from Artie's point of view, what is happening in the story? And most of the time, it has to do with Artie interacting with his father in some way, usually negative, but interacting with his father some way. So even when it's not about Vladek and it's focusing on Artie's point of view, it's still basically about Vladek because it's about their relationship in some way. Like the picture on the screen, you can see where it's him waking him up early in the morning to come help fix his roof or whatever. So to review these steps for analysis, the first thing and most important thing is to read the story the first time for comprehension. Go slow, take notes, reread when you need to, look words up, ask yourself questions, make mental images, do all the strategies you've heard before in class, because they really do help reading for comprehension. If you've read something and you don't understand what happens when you're finished, you didn't read for comprehension. It means you need to take a look at how you read it and reread it. But then, once you do understand what you read, you can ask yourself questions like, what is not explicitly stated about the plot, or the characters, or the setting, and then you can start looking at the way the author told the story, and you can start picking out those things that aren't directly stated, and you start to see that there are things in the story that help you better understand what the author is trying to do in a literature sort of way, instead of just straight up telling a story about the Holocaust, because there's obviously more going on in literature, as you well know in high school literature. And so this is a method you can use to help you figure those things out. So thank you for listening, and I appreciate your time, and you definitely want to use this when you're reading your own readings, which you're going to start today or tomorrow. Thank you. Bye.